We should probably do some sort of introduction. Like, hi, everybody. I'm Patricia.
I'm Lee.
And we're weird as fuck.
Yeah, I suppose you probably should, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Because someday we might be famous. Okay. So. Okay. So how about we talk about reincarnation?
Okay.
Okay. Now, we've talked about it before between the two of us, and most of the stories that we've discussed, and most of the stories that most believers in reincarnation discuss, deal with kids.
Yeah, when they can sit there and tell people what a fighter plane looks like and how to fly it and all that stuff when they're little kids. They should not know that information.
The little boy that led the police to a murderer and a murder victim. There was a case in India of a little girl who led her current family to her previous family and knew details that a 4-year-old shouldn't know. In all of these cases, however, typically these kids forget by the time they're in their teens. So the memories start to fade. They're clear when they're tiny, and they start to fade as they get older. And I don't want to call those cases common because reincarnation stories aren't all that common, but they're a little bit more mainstream, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. So I went looking for something that was well known and well documented that would provide maybe more concrete evidence that it's possible for us to live more than one existence. So I'm going to tell you the story of Dorothy Eady. Dorothy Eady was born in 1904 in a lower middle class Irish family in the UK. By all accounts, Dorothy was a perfectly normal baby. Her parents were normal, nothing exceptional about them. Dad was a master tailor. Mom was a homemaker. Dorothy lived a perfectly average life in her happy little seaside home until she was 3, when she fell headfirst down the stairs. The doctor was summoned and pronounced Dorothy dead. There was no evidence of life. He used a mirror in front of her face to check for respiration and a feather. There was nothing. He had no heartbeat, nothing. So they put the child in her room and called for the coroner. It took them about an hour to come to pick up the body. And when they did, Dorothy was awake and playing with her toys. And she had an accent. And she asked them to take her home.
And you said you are home.
Well, this obviously, for obvious reasons, this perplexed her parents because it no longer sounded like Dorothy and, bitch, you are home. We just pulled you off the bottom of the stairs. We know who you are. You belong here. But Dorothy insisted that no, she didn't know where home was, but she knew this wasn't it. And I'm going to try to condense this into our 30-minute window. So I'm not going to get into huge amounts of detail. I'll have the links up on our website so people can go looking for more. There's a couple of really good movies that you can look at to explore this a little bit more if you'd like to. But anywho, so Dorothy, being a precocious 3-year-old, began questioning everything around her, including why her parents worshipped the way that they did and why they didn't follow the old ways. Dorothy was asked to stay home from Sunday school because she was questioning the interpretation of the heathen Egyptians. She got kicked out of Catholic Mass after being interrogated by the priest and having him come to their family home and saying, there's something wrong with your kid. Don't bring her back. Which, seriously, you're supposed to help people in crisis.
Church.
Yeah.
Lots of churches will abandon you when you're not right.
And she was kicked out of a girls' school for refusing to sing a hymn that painted the Egyptians in a negative light. all by the time she was 4.
She's got quite the attitude already.
I love Dorothy from the beginning. Although I wouldn't have loved being Dorothy's mom. That must have been, I mean, you can imagine this is like 1908 and you're dealing with this. People aren't quite as understanding. But for Dorothy and her family, the real breakthrough came when her parents planned a trip to the British Museum in London. And they had planned to leave Dorothy with a sitter, but they couldn't find anybody willing to put up with Dorothy's shit, so they had to take her with them.
Gee, imagine that.
Imagine that. They assumed that she would be a problem because she was little at this point. And you know how little kids are in museums. They get bored, they run around, they do weird stuff. But to their utter amazement, when they got into the museum and they went into the New Kingdom exhibit, which is the Egyptian exhibit, Dorothy started screaming, "This is my home," and was running around from statue to statue, kissing their feet, demanding that people take off their shoes and show respect, because that is what you do when you're in the presence of deity. And when it was time to leave, she sat down and refused to go.
Not what they were expecting.
Yeah, apparently she sat for hours and just stared at these exhibits, absolutely entranced by them. After that, she made regular pilgrimages to the British Museum, sometimes when she was supposed to be at school, unbeknownst to her parents. Dorothy started playing hooky real young. And on one of her trips, she met renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who encouraged her in her studies of modern Egyptology and the study of hieroglyphics. And by the age of 10, Dorothy was able to translate hieroglyphics into English. By the age of 10. Which to me is either astonishing proof that this girl was remembering something she already knew, or that she had a profound intellect, because scientists study for decades to learn how to translate hieroglyphs appropriately.
Yeah, there's lots of them that have spent their whole lives trying to figure it out.
Exactly. And archaeologists praised her for the work that she was doing. They were amazed. They weren't saying, this is gibberish. They weren't discounting what she was doing. They were actually acknowledging that she was doing a good job at age 10. By her early teens, she'd moved in with her grandmother in Sussex. The story says that it was because her dad had been doing some research and decided that getting into the motion picture industry was a good investment, investing in like movie theaters and things. And so they were moving around a lot, and it was best for her to remain someplace stable. I think it's probably more that they were just exhausted. Raising Dorothy had to have been quite a challenge. But during her time with her grandmother, she would spend every moment that was available to her going to the library and researching ancient Egypt. She performed in school plays about the subject. She was obsessed. Her obsession was such that she would sleepwalk. She had nightmares. She claimed that she had visitations, that she saw apparitions. And it got to the point where she was institutionalized several times because they thought she was bonkers. And she kept telling them, no, I'm remembering. I know these things. These things are true. At 16, she finally left school and decided that she was going to continue her study independently into Egyptology. She went to every museum and archaeological site that she could get to in the UK, thanks to her dad's investment in cinema, which turned out to be quite a good one. He did well.
That would be a hell of a cash deal there.
Well, and at 16, it would have been 1920. So the roaring 20s.
Yeah, now they're all going out of business.
Yeah, well, if you got into Netflix on the ground floor, you're doing really well, because we're all stuck at home and we're all streaming Netflix, and they've got to be worth $1 billion by now. But anyway, so she studied independently, and sorry, there's a hair in my face. So she began studying independently and learned everything that she could, everything that was available to her from the information that she had at her fingertips. When she was 27, she'd moved to London, and she was working as a writer. with the Egyptian Public Relations magazine, and she wrote articles and had made cartoons campaigning for Egypt's independence, because at that time, remember, everything was owned by the UK, pretty much, in the 1920s. The sun never set on the British Empire, remember?
Yeah.
Back in the day. So she was campaigning for Egyptian independence, and she met Iman Abdel Migwid. I don't know. He was an Egyptian student studying English at the time. They continued a long correspondence, and in 1931, a few years later, she moved to Egypt to marry him. When she got off the plane, she bent down and kissed the ground and said, "Finally, I'm home." And she would spend the rest of her life in Egypt. She and Iman had one child, Sety. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. Sety was the pharaoh that she claimed visited her in her dreams. He would also play a really important part in her origin story later on. I'm getting there. Just looking at me, staring at me. So throughout all of this time, though, Dorothy is continuing with her claims, and she's telling her stories, and she's pretty unapologetic about what she thinks is happening. She doesn't expect everyone to believe her. She knows how it sounds, but she's absolutely convinced that the things that she's saying is true. She's not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. She's not making wild claims about lizard men coming out of the center of the earth.
Yeah.
She honestly believes that she lived then. She was from there. And as she progresses through her life, she provides evidence to archaeologists that gives a lot of credence to her stories. They still think she's delightfully kooky, but I'll get to that. So in 1935, after just 4 years of marriage, Iman and his family are thoroughly weirded out by Dorothy and her stories and her visitations and her claims of seeing apparitions. And he's offered a job in Iraq, and he decides to take it. And she tells him to peace out, see ya, takes the kid, and they divorce. They weren't weirded out enough to think that the child was in danger, so they didn't keep him. She kept him. She raised her son. And we never hear from the husband again.
Hit the road.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess if your wife... There's a line, I think, between delightfully eccentric and just, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Yeah, we get a little old listening to that all the time.
Yes and no. I mean, I really applaud her standing by the courage of her convictions. She believed what she was saying, and she carried that belief to her grave. So in 1937, she and her son moved to Nazlat al-Saman, where she met an Egyptian archaeologist, Salim Hassan, of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. He hired her as a secretary and a draftswoman. And now remember, Dorothy left school at 16. She doesn't even have a high school diploma. And over the next several years, according to Barbara Lesko, she became a great help to the Egyptian scholars, especially Hassan and Fakhri, correcting their English and writing English language articles for others. This poorly educated Englishwoman developed in English into a first-rate draftswoman and prolific and talented writer who, even under her own name, produced articles, essays, monographs, and books of great range, wit, and substance. So this woman with a 10th grade education, she was so vital and well respected by the other archaeologists that when Hassan died, she was not only employed to complete his magnum opus, a 10-volume history of the new dynasty in Egypt, but she was employed by Fakhri during his exploration and excavation of Dashur, where she continued to study and write about her favorite topic, of course, Egypt. And this was, back in the 1930s and 40s, when she actually got to not only go into the Great Pyramid, but she camped out there. So she got to spend a lot of time at these sites that you can't even get to now. It was during this time that she claimed to have been visited by Hora. I'm not sure who that is.
Hurrah!
Yeah, I knew that was coming. in the early 1950s. She reported nighttime visitations by Horror. And he slowly dictated to her over a 12-month period the story of who she had been prior to being Dorothy Eady. The story took up about 70 pages of cursive hieroglyphic text. I'm not sure how you do cursive hieroglyphic text. I'd have to see that. I thought that they were cartouches.
These little stamps of things.
That's what I thought, but apparently not.
Maybe not. Who knows?
And it described the life of a young woman in ancient Egypt named Ben Treshet, who would later become Dorothy Eady. Ben Treshet, which also means harp of joy, is described in this text as being of humble origins. Her mother was a vegetable seller and her father was a soldier. When she was very young, about the age of 3, remember, age 3 is when Dorothy fell down the stairs, her mother died and she was placed in the temple of Kom El Sultan because her father couldn't afford to care for her. Just offload the kid on whoever will take it. There, she was raised to be a priestess in the order of Sety. And when she was 12 years old, the high priest asked her if she wished to go out into the world at age 12, you're on your own, kid, or stay and become a consecrated virgin. She, being 12 years old, what are you going to do? Go out into a world where you're probably going to have to become a prostitute because you have no way of caring for yourself, or stay in the temple? So she chose to stay in the temple and took the vows. During the next 2 years, this is Ben Treshet, she learned that her role in the annual drama of Osiris's passion and resurrection, a role that could only be played by virgin priestesses.
Of course.
Consecrated to Isis. One day, Sety I visited and spoke to her. Remember, she's 14 years old, and this is a grown-ass fucking man who spoke to her and thought she was quite witty and fetching. And so they began an affair, which I can only imagine that she didn't really have much say in whether she participated in or not. This is the pharaoh.
Well, back then, 12 and 13, 14-year-old kids were getting married.
Yeah.
And having children.
I know, and it's disgusting. It just keeps getting grosser because she gets pregnant. She's supposed to be a consecrated virgin.
Yeah, kind of fucked that up.
When the high priest found out, he interrogated her. Apparently torture was involved and got the whole story. Now, the pharaoh impregnated a consecrated virgin. This looks real bad for Pharaoh. And it brings shame upon the temple and shame upon her as well. So, of course, she's going to die, nobody else.
Well, of course.
The punishment for her quote-unquote crime, which she probably didn't have any say in whether or not she participated in this crime because it's fucking Pharaoh. She's going to be executed. She's pregnant. They're just killing everybody. Except for Pharaoh because, you know.
They did a lot of that shit back then.
Anyway, to avoid this and to avoid shaming her Pharaoh, she committed suicide because the trial would bring out the whole truth. And thus moves forward in time to become Dorothy Eady. That whole story just pissed me off.
Yeah, I kind of got that.
So Dorothy gets all of this information and she's convinced that this is not just a fever dream or a hallucination or whatever psychologists would call it now, but that it's actual verification that she is who she claims to have always been. A priestess, an unknown, you know, with a lot of these stories, especially when you have people who are a little bit off, who are claiming to have been reincarnated people, it's always somebody famous, somebody that you knew.
Yeah.
Lots of Napoleons, lots of Cleopatras. She's claiming to be a nobody priestess who committed suicide at 14. So to me, I mean, I think if this is there's going to be anything that gives any credence in the beginning to this, it's going to be that she's not claiming to be anything other than just a person. So in 1956, the Dasher project that she was working on was terminated, and she had a choice to make. She was offered a really well-paying job in Cairo, or move to Abydos and take a less prestigious, less lucrative job. But here's the thing. Abydos is where the Temple of Sety is, where she claims to have practiced as a priestess. And so she's drawn there. Fakhri told her to go to the Great Pyramid, stand at the top of it, because back in those days you could actually climb the pyramid, face west, and ask Kovadi. Sorry, my Latin is really bad, which literally translates to where are you going or where are we marching to? And her answer was Abydos. So she reported that Sety I had approved of the move. Sety I having been dead for 3,000 years, so what does he care? He claimed that the wheel of fate was turning and this would be a time of testing. If she was chaste, she would now undo Pentreshet's ancient sin. Again, that pissed me off. Her ancient sin. Of having an affair with a guy that was probably old enough to be her grandfather. And then him not taking responsibility for where he was putting his dick.
It was all because the gods told him to.
Undue influence. That's a crime. Anyway, so it was in Abydos, and now you see why it's important that she named her son Sety.
Yeah.
After the guy that got her killed in her first life. It was there that she began to be known as Sety. So her son's name is Sety, and it was tradition, I don't know if it still is, in Egypt for the mother to be known by the name of her firstborn child. Means mother of, and then Sety.
That's weird.
Because you have no value other than what you produce from your loins.
Because it's a man or something, right?
Men probably made it up. I don't know.
Over there, that was it. Women were nothing.
Tell Cleopatra that.
Still aren't. Yeah, it's just very few have ever gotten any power.
Yeah, well, it depends because I think culturally, it's still kind of dark, but how's America any better?
Well, now at least they can drive cars and do stuff like that now, which was, a couple of years ago was the first time they could even drive
in Saudi Arabia.
Cars and shit.
That's Saudi Arabia is actually a
I'm
country,
off, yeah.
But yeah, it's not great for women anywhere. Let me just say that. Iceland is better. It's cold. Men need women more there. I don't know. I'm just being an asshole.
Too
I'm sorry.
fucking cold over there to do shit for me.
Geothermal everywhere.
Fuck that.
So anyway, this is where she began being known as Sety, and that's how we'll refer to her through the rest of the story. And it's also where her advanced knowledge of ancient Egypt began to confirm that what she'd been saying all of her life was true. So until this time, much of what Dorothy Sety was able to produce for the Egyptology community was assumed to be because she was just a very perceptive, very well-read, well-studied scholar. Her scholarship was actually praised often, even though she had very limited education. But in Abydos, the ancient home of the girl she claims to used to have been, she was able to describe paintings that hadn't been published yet. They actually took her into a crypt where she had served as priestess. The paintings had just been discovered. They were just being cleaned. They took her in there in the dark. No photos of these paintings had been published. She hadn't been permitted in there. Nobody had been permitted in there up until this point. And in the dark, the archaeologist asked her to describe what should be on the walls. And she did it perfectly. And there was no way for her to have known that. She was also able to tell archaeologists that there were gardens. There should be gardens in a certain place. And this was the configuration of the gardens. And they said, no, that's impossible, until they found them exactly where she said they would be and exactly the configuration she said they should be. She also told them that Nefertiti's tomb is just to the side of Tutankhamun's tomb. And until recently, archaeologists thought that was a false claim, but now they think that she might be right. And these are things, she's been dead for quite a while now. These are things that she shouldn't have known and she couldn't have guessed at, not been so accurate. She also had advanced knowledge of folk medicine and was able to cure ailments that people suffered from, including herself, her arthritis, vision issues, a child's breathing problems that were all well documented using the folk medicines that would have been used at the time of Pharaoh Sety I. She detailed many other modern practices that were also transmitted down from ancient times in short articles that she wrote between 1960 and 1975. And many of these correlations between these practices were only confirmed in the last couple of decades. So she was saying, this is true. And now archaeologists are saying, well, yeah, she's right. It was. And there's no way for her to have known that. You can only guess it so much.
Yeah.
In 1965, I believe, she was forced, or 1964, she was forced into retirement because that was the mandatory retirement age. And before you get jealous, her pension was only $30 a month. That's not a lot of money. But so valuable was she to the Department of Antiquities that they made an exception for her and they allowed her to keep working for another 5 years because she really, really wanted to. In 1972, she suffered from a minor heart attack and she decided to sell her home and live in a zareba, which is a tiny reed hut, which doesn't sound like a great place for an aging woman to live in. Where the fuck was her son and why wasn't he taking care of her? Fortunately for her, someone who was previously a caretaker of the temple that she devoted so much of her time to studying and help provide information for, the one that her previous self had served as priestess, he built a little tiny house for her to live in so that she could have someplace sheltered and not a reed hut to live out the rest of her days. I've got the information here about, sorry, I lost my place. Here we go. A radar scan in the year 2000 produced evidence of 2 chambers just to the side of Tutankhamun's tomb that they believe is where Nefertiti was hidden. Because remember, she was a rather controversial queen. We'll just leave it at that. And they do believe that it is her tomb. In 2015, Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves wrote an article that confirmed that this was likely what Dorothy Eady had said all those years ago was likely true, that this was Nefertiti's tomb that they had found just to the side of Tutankhamun's. And again, that's information that she couldn't have just guessed at and been right. The Valley of Kings is massive.
Yeah.
She could have pointed to any spot in the sand and said, no, it's there. And true, Tutankhamun's tomb had been recently found when she was a young woman, but, we're talking about 40 years later, and she's saying, no, the person you're looking for is right over there. We planted her there. So the general public tend to focus on the fact that she was kind of an off-the-wall weird character, and she definitely was. But again, this is a woman who her entire life, from the age of 3 up until she died, was absolutely 100% convinced that these things that she was saying was true. And the volume of scholarly articles that she wrote in support of her claims, the knowledge that she provided, and the ease at which she picked up that knowledge gives a certain amount of credence to the fact that she was telling the truth.
Yeah, she sat there and devoted her life to it.
Well, that could just be an obsession. I mean, we all know people who are obsessed. Elon Musk is a brilliant rocket scientist. That doesn't mean he's the reincarnation of Werner von Braun.
No, I've definitely seen a lot of shows where a kid sat there and described this battleship that where he thought he came from. He was a soldier or something on it.
Yeah, that was James the Third.
And the kid just described the whole ship from details to details as a little kid, you know. And there's a lot of shit that, I mean, you can't really dispute it. How the hell would he know, you know?
And that's really, to me, really interesting. And then I pulled this one from a different article, but I'll read this to you too. And it says, while the general public tend to focus on the beauty of ancient Egyptian artifacts, scholars highly value texts which reveal more about history and religious beliefs. Obviously, we like to look at the pretty stuff, but it's the written stuff that really gives us the information that we need, right? Since Edgar Casey, a clairvoyant of Presbyterian background, asserted while in a trance state that a hall of records was to be found in the area of the Sphinx, there have been repeated attempts to find its supposed location. In 1973, Sety recalled asking Sety I about the hall of records, because remember, she was receiving visitations. He replied that every temple had a book repository, the Paramajat, but that the one attached to the temple of Amun-Ra in Luxor contained all the important documents from the time of the ancestors, including those that survived the political upheaval at the end of the 6th dynasty. In 1952, Sety translated for Abdul Qadir inscriptions from ram statues he had uncovered. She's translating hieroglyphics for scholars. This is how much they trusted her opinion. This is an uneducated British woman who is now translating hieroglyphics. I just want to drive that point home. They'd been found in the area where Sety located the Hall of Records. Contrary to normal practice for this type of statue, there was no writing on the back, suggesting that they had once been placed against an otherwise unknown wall or building. Based on Sety's description and the location of the rams, both she and Dr. Zini believe that the Hall of Records is likely to be located under the modern building which houses the Arab Socialist League. Good luck getting in there, guys.
Yeah.
So most scholars obviously aren't willing to embrace the idea of reincarnation. And not even all believers in reincarnation embrace Sety's claims. They think that she's either nuts. I mean, you have to explore that as a possibility, obviously. Or she suffers from something, not suffers, but what she's experienced is something called replacement reincarnation. In other words, Dorothy Eady died, and the person that replaced her is the person who would become Sety. So she was an empty vessel, and a wandering spirit moved in, sort of possession. Which, to my mind, the fact that she woke up with all of this knowledge, she didn't know her parents, she didn't know her home. I think there's a lot of credence in that. Which to me really isn't much different than reincarnation. It's still a wandering soul looking for a place to land. You just don't have a ready-made body. You take an available empty shell. But regardless of whether or not you should believe that she's reincarnated from a teenage priestess that died 3,000 years ago, she is without a doubt one of the most well-respected, diligent scholars of ancient Egypt. She published dozens of books, articles, and essays on the subject and helped to further our modern understanding of the history of the great nation. And apparently she was a lot of fun at parties, so people enjoyed chatting with her because she was just so out there and she had absolutely no shame in what she was saying. You know, some people would hide that information because they don't want to be ridiculed, and she did not give a fuck what you thought of her. She was just down to share her story, and I gotta love that. But she passed away in 1981 at the age of 77. So we can't talk to her. Unless she comes back. So, you know.
Who knows?
It could happen. So what do you think? Is that compelling evidence for reincarnation?
Seems like it. Wonder what happened to the poor little 3-year-old that died.
I don't know. Maybe she went on to something else. I mean, it was 1904, so it's 116 years ago. Plenty of time for her to made her way back. 7 billion people on the planet. Maybe she came back and didn't remember anything. I mean, she only had 3 years on the planet.
Maybe.
It seems like all of the children that they interview who remember past life experiences all died really traumatic events.
Yeah.
And, falling down the stairs is pretty traumatic, but not quite as traumatic as having somebody plant a hatchet in your forehead.
Yeah.
Which is how that kid who caught the murderer died. But there you go. Sety, reincarnation. Believe it or not. Wait, I can't say that. I'm pretty sure that's patented or copyrighted.
Oh, who cares?
I do. I don't want to get sued. Anyway.
You didn't finish the sentence. So
no,
you're
I didn't.
Fine.
Yay, me. So let us know what you think.
Like us.
Join us.
Join us.
Bye.
Bye.
Want to stay connected between shows? You can find us on Instagram at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Twitter at WeirdAsFuckPod1, on Facebook at WeirdAsFCKPodcast. Send us an email at weirdasfckkpodcast@gmail.com, or come on over to our website at www.weirdasfck.com. There you can check out our blog, pick up some merch, look over our sources, and even share your weird experiences. You might even make it on a future episode. We would love to hear from you. Until then, tune in and keep it weird.